It is Wednesday. That means all about the law for the balance of the show. That is the case. Now, the FBI raid at the office of Michael Cohen is what we're going to talk about now. New details emerging and about how it all went down. New details reveal how the early morning FBI raids on President Trump's personal lawyer unfolded. Michael Cohen, spotted leaving dinner in New York City last night, telling ABC News that the FBI didn't storm into his hotel room. They simply knocked on the door, describing it as respectful and courteous. He went on to say, quote, "It was clear the raid wasn't a personal vendetta," end quote, but admitted it was very difficult for his family. In 3 separate raids on his home, office, and hotel room, agents seized electronic devices, phones, and financial documents dating back to 2013. A source who saw the search warrant tells ABC that Cohen's being investigated for possible bank and wire fraud, and that investigators are focusing on the $130,000 payment Cohen made to Stormy Daniels, the adult film star who claims she had an affair with Donald Trump back in 2006, something the White House to this point has denied. Cohen made the hush payment to Daniels just 11 days before the 2016 election. The Times is reporting that the FBI is also looking for documents relating to a payment to a former Playboy model, Karen McDougal, who claims she also had a 10-month affair with Mr. Trump. The president's lawyers, they've also denied her claims. Cohen, Trump's personal lawyer for more than a decade, has repeatedly pledged his loyalty to President Trump here on Fox News.
And I will do anything to protect Mr. Trump.
But now, he may be out of a job.
Does Michael Cohen still represent the president?
I'm not sure. I would refer you to Michael Cohen on that.
Legal analyst Dan Abrams thinks
that if Michael Cohen's indicted, it's not a question of if President Trump pardons him, it's a question of when.
Now, former federal prosecutor Pell, he joins me to take a look at several aspects of this. Let me try again. Aspects of this, and also how it all would have happened in the days and weeks before the actual raid. Roland, I know you got to hypothesize for this one, but help me out here, because as I talked to the guys before, they don't hand these warrants out, federal judge, like they're Pez. The threshold, given the scrutiny and the history attached to this, obviously is as high a bar as we can think of. So give me an idea, as your best guess, what led up to the request for the warrant and the granting of the warrant? What do you think may have tipped off Muller and team? Wait a minute. We got to move on this and move soon. And what did they have to present to a judge for the judge to say, okay, I'm going to give you a warrant?
Yeah, this is a search warrant for a lawyer's office is a very difficult thing for the Department of Justice to obtain. There are many, many hurdles they have to go over to get a search warrant for a lawyer's office. What had to happen first is Mr. Muller, in the course of the Russia probe, must have seen evidence that he believed, A, was evidence of a crime, and B, was likely to be located with Michael Cohen in his office or in his home in the areas searched. Seeing that evidence and analyzing it, Mr. Mueller must have decided that this is not evidence directly related to the Russia probe. It involves something else. It appears to involve Stormy Daniels and the Playboy Bunny. He then realized that the evidence was located in the Southern District of New York, and that's where the locations were that needed to be searched. So he handed off what he had to the Southern District of New York. The Southern District of New York would then have to get approval to search this lawyer's office by going right up through the Department of Justice all the way to Rod Rosenstein or somebody similar. I believe that if we served a subpoena for this evidence, it wouldn't be produced. So all those hurdles had to be got over. Apparently they were. A warrant was issued by an independent magistrate judge, and here we are. Now, I do think, Richard, and I hope you'll ask me why I think this is actually a brilliant move by Mueller and a Mueller bank shot, because that's something that hasn't been widely reported, and I think it's a very interesting
And I definitely want to get to that, but for the folks at home who say, wait a minute, I heard obstruction, I heard collusion. There were 2 buckets here. The collusion because somebody in this campaign or even in the administration worked in cahoots with the Russians against national interests. The obstruction, people either weren't being forthright, people were lying, people were not being, and we've seen certainly indictments already. Already people have pled guilty as cooperating witnesses, the rest. But now you've got a third bucket. I don't know what you call this bucket, and it's not being handled as you just articulated by Team Muller. They had to go to a third party. What do you call this third bucket, and how does it play into the existing investigation for obstruction as well as collusion?
This appears to be a Michael Cohen crime by Michael Cohen relating to bank fraud, money laundering, and the like. I suspect, and Richard, this is just Roland Riopel's gut guess, that it might have something to do with Michael Cohen obtaining the money to pay off Stormy Daniels and the Playboy Bunny. He may have filled out an application for a bank loan. We know he got a mortgage or a home equity line to pay these monies. He might have, you typically would have to fill out an application that tells the bank why you want to get that money. And if he filled out that application saying, I want the money to renovate my home, and then he used the money to pay off Stormy Daniels, well, you got a bank fraud right there. It may be that simple.
Roland, is anything they find, whether it be the hotel room, the home, or the office, even if it's beyond what the warrant was asking for specifically, you know, that as you hypothesized, that they find out he's been an attorney for 10 years for Trump, that they find out, wait a minute here, this guy was working, let's say, for the Moscow hotel here, and they were paying off people, whether it be in Russia or they knew what the Russians were going to do with the hacking. Does the warrant, is it blanket enough that they can use any of that evidence that they come across in the course of this investigation?
Well, that's this. Now you're getting to what I call the Muller bank shot, because what the warrant allows the FBI to do is to search through Mr. Cohen's files in his office and at his home to look for evidence of this bank fraud. There is a concept in Fourth Amendment law of plain view. In other words, if I'm allowed to search Richard French's home for a firearm, and I walk in and sitting on the coffee table is a kilo of heroin, it's in plain view, and I'm allowed to seize that too, because that is clearly criminal. In this case, because they are searching for documents, the FBI has to look through the documents and look for evidence of this bank fraud that is authorized by the warrant. As they look through those documents, if they find documents during that search that are in effectively plain view because they are in Mr. Cohen's files, and those documents support Mr. Mueller's Russiagate probe, they will alert Mr. Mueller of that fact. We saw in plain view documents that show the Trump organization being paid off by Russian oligarchs or something like that. Mr. Mueller will then go back and get his own search warrant to go back through those documents and seize the documents that are directly related to his probe. So this may have been a brilliant legal move by Mr. Mueller, handing off a search warrant that is not directly related to his probe, which may ultimately gather for him significant evidence related to Russiagate once the FBI starts looking at Mr. Cohen's documents. All
right, Roland, I only got a couple minutes, and I'm going to be bringing in Senator Blumenthal to see from the legislative side where their line would be in terms of protecting Mueller and whether or not even legislatively they'd come up with some formal protection for him. But nonetheless, I want to remind our audience what the White House press secretary had to say about whether or not Trump can fire Mueller.
Does he believe he has the power to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller? Does he believe that's within his power?
Certainly believes he has the power to do so.
Okay, so Sarah Huckabee Sanders says yes, the president believes he can fire him, and clearly it made it sound like this was something they've already looked into. The three players here in question, Obviously, we're talking about Rosenstein here, who's the player since Sessions recused himself. Obviously, we're also talking about Bob Mueller here, or the Attorney General, who's obviously on the you-know-what list for the president, Mr. Sessions, ever since he decided to take himself out of this. Can the president, if he wants to, unilaterally fire Mueller? And if not, what are the chains that he would have to go through to actually find somebody that would be willing to do a modern-day Saturday Night Massacre? Sunday.
Now, I don't believe that the president can fire Mueller directly. I don't believe he can do like he does on The Apprentice and just say, "You're fired, Mr. Mueller." I think that Mr. Mueller can only be fired for cause. I think the firing has to come from the Department of Justice. So what Mr. Trump will have to do is to fire either Mr. Sessions or Mr. Rosenstein or both. He'd have to put in patsies in their place to who would be willing to fire Mr. Mueller. Scott Pruitt seems like a pretty good person to replace Mr. Sessions. And once Pruitt replaces Mr. Sessions, he becomes Attorney General. If he can, he could fire Mueller. The problem, of course, with this is that both Mr. Rosenstein and Mr. Sessions' positions are, I believe, positions that must be confirmed by the Senate. So the Senate would be in a position to block Mr. Trump from appointing a patsy to fire Mueller, and we could have a constitutional standoff. And at some point, somebody is going to file a lawsuit to determine whether there is cause to fire Mr. Mueller, and the courts may ultimately decide that Mr. Trump can't fire Mr. Mueller and nobody can fire Mr. Mueller until there is cause to do so, which is what is required by the statute, in which case the courts will be protecting Mr. Mueller, even if the legislative branch cannot get its act together to do so.
Well, that's a perfect segue for me. We're going to get right into that. But Roland, as always, my friend, thank you so much.
Yeah, and my best wishes to Senator Blumenthal to protect Mr. Mueller.
I think you speak for many. And coming up next, you've already heard from the attorneys when it comes to the Russia story and the Cohen raid. Next, Senator Blumenthal will join us. He is on the Judiciary Committee. He's going to talk about both the Mueller probe and also Facebook, as he was one of the senators who just grilled Mark Zuckerberg.